My husband came home and said, "I think we should separate. I need some space to figure out what I want." 2 weeks later, I discovered it was all fake. His single friends had convinced him to pretend to leave me to see how desperate I'd get and gain control in our relationship. So I played along. I became the perfect, submissive wife for 3 months while secretly meeting with divorce lawyers. My name is Lisa, and for 5 years I thought I had a solid marriage with my husband Jake. We met in college, dated through our senior year, and got married 2 years after graduation. Jake worked as a regional sales manager for a logistics company, while I was a nurse at the local hospital. We had a comfortable life in suburban Phoenix, nice house, good jobs, and what I believed was a partnership built on love and mutual respect. The problems started subtly about 6 months before everything exploded. Jake had always been social, but he began spending more time with a specific group of single male friends from his work and college. These weren't men I'd grown close to over the years, they were the type who seemed to view marriage as a trap and frequently made jokes about ball and chain dynamics. The ringleader of this group was a guy named Brad, Jake's college roommate who worked in sales at the same company. Brad was 32, never married, and proud of what he called his bachelor lifestyle. He constantly bragged about manipulating women, playing dating games, and maintaining control in his relationships. At first, Jake would come home from nights out with Brad and the others with stories I found mildly concerning. They'd spent the evening at bars talking about how married men were whipped and how single guys had more freedom and power in their relationships. Brad says married guys give up too much control, Jake mentioned one night after a particularly long evening out. He thinks wives start taking their husbands for granted because they know the guy isn't going anywhere. "Do you feel like I take you for granted?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "No, not exactly," Jake said. "But maybe Brad has a point about keeping some independence in a relationship." These conversations became more frequent over the following months. Jake started questioning aspects of our marriage that had never been issues before: how we split household responsibilities, how we made financial decisions, how we spent our free time. More concerning was his changing attitude toward me personally. Jake began making critical comments about my appearance, my career, and my contributions to our household. These weren't major confrontations, but rather a steady stream of small criticisms that chipped away at my confidence. "You've been working a lot of overtime lately," he'd say. "Brad's girlfriend always makes sure she's available when he wants to spend time together." Or, "Maybe you could put more effort into how you look when I come home from work. Sarah down the street always looks put together when her husband gets home." I started second-guessing myself and trying harder to meet these new, undefined expectations. I worked fewer overtime shifts, spent more money on clothes and makeup, and tried to anticipate Jake's needs before he expressed them. But nothing I did seemed to satisfy his increasingly critical attitude. Instead of appreciating my efforts, Jake seemed to interpret them as confirmation that I needed to try harder. The shift in our relationship was gradual but unmistakable. Jake became more demanding and less considerate, as if he was testing how much he could get away with. He'd make plans without consulting me, spend money on himself without discussion, and expect me to accommodate his schedule and preferences without reciprocal consideration. When I tried to address these changes, Jake would tell me I was being needy or controlling, language I'd never heard from him during our first 4 years of marriage. The final month before the fake breakup was particularly difficult. Jake's behavior became increasingly erratic and distant. He'd come home late without explanation, be dismissive during conversations, and seem almost annoyed by my presence. I started wondering if Jake was having an affair or going through some kind of personal crisis. When I suggested couples counseling, he said our problems weren't serious enough to warrant professional help, and that I was being dramatic. Then came the night that everything changed. It was a Tuesday in March, and Jake came home from work with an expression I'd never seen before: cold, distant, and almost rehearsed. He sat down on our living room couch and asked me to sit across from him, not beside him. "Lisa, I think we should separate," he said without preamble. "I need some space to figure out what I want." The words hit me like a physical blow. We'd been having some difficulties, but nothing that seemed to warrant separation. We'd never even had a serious fight about our problems. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. "I mean, I think we rushed into marriage," Jake said. "We were young when we got together, and I don't think I've ever had the chance to figure out who I am as an independent person." "Jake, we've been together for 7 years, married for 5. If you wanted to be independent, why didn't you say something before we got married?" "I didn't realize it then," he said. "But spending time with Brad and the guys has made me see that I've lost myself in this relationship. I need to take some time to figure out if this marriage is what I really want." I was devastated. My husband was talking about our marriage like it was a mistake, and he was crediting his single friends for this revelation. "What can I do?" I asked, tears starting to form. "How can we work on this together? Maybe if you tried harder to be the wife I need, We wouldn't be here, Jake said coldly. The cruelty of that statement was breathtaking. I'd been trying harder for months, bending over backward to accommodate his changing expectations, and now he was suggesting our problems were entirely my fault. What do you mean by the wife you need? I asked. Someone who puts our marriage first, Jake said. Someone who makes an effort to keep me happy instead of just assuming I'll always be here. I spent the next 2 weeks living in hell. Jake moved into our guest bedroom and treated me like a roommate he barely tolerated. He'd come home from work, eat dinner without much conversation, and spend his evenings out with Brad and his friends. During this time, I threw myself into trying to save our marriage. I cooked elaborate meals, kept the house immaculate, bought new clothes, and tried to anticipate Jake's every need. I was desperate to prove that I could be the wife he needed and convince him not to leave me. Jake's response to these efforts was lukewarm at best. He'd acknowledge my cooking or cleaning with brief thanks, but he didn't seem particularly impressed or grateful. If anything, he seemed to view my efforts as confirmation that I was finally stepping up to meet basic expectations. The more I tried, the more distant Jake became. It was as if my desperation was evidence that he'd been right to question our marriage. 2 weeks into this nightmare, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was doing laundry and found a piece of paper in Jake's jeans pocket. It was a handwritten note with what looked like talking points or reminders. The note included phrases like maintain distance, don't give in too quickly, and see how far she'll go to keep you. At first, I thought it might be related to his work. Jake did sales presentations that sometimes involved negotiation strategies. But then I saw a line that made my blood run cold. Brad says 2 weeks is usually enough to establish new dynamic. I stared at that note for several minutes, trying to process what I was reading. It sounded like Jake was following some kind of script designed to manipulate me. That evening, after Jake left to meet his friends, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I went through his phone. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Jake had been exchanging text messages with Brad and 2 other friends about our separation. The messages revealed that the entire thing was a game designed to make me more grateful and compliant in our marriage. Brad, how's Operation Reset going? Is she getting desperate yet? Jake, she's definitely trying harder. Cooking every night, bought new clothes, keeps asking what she can do to fix things. Brad, perfect. That's exactly what we said would happen. Women need to remember they're not irreplaceable. Friend number 3, how much longer are you going to keep it up? Jake, Brad thinks I should give it another week or 2, really let it sink in. Then when I decide to work things out, she'll be so grateful she'll do whatever I want. There were dozens of messages over the past 2 weeks, with Brad coaching Jake on how to maintain emotional distance, what to say to keep me insecure, and how to gradually reintroduce intimacy once I'd been sufficiently humbled. The most sickening part was a message from Jake to the group, you guys were right. I can't believe how much power this gives me. She's like a completely different person. I sat in our bedroom reading these messages and felt something inside me break. Not heartbreak, something deeper. The man I've been married to for 5 years had spent 2 weeks deliberately torturing me for sport, coached by his single friends who viewed relationships as power games. But instead of confronting Jake immediately, I made a strategic decision. If Jake wanted to play games, I would play along, but on my terms. The next morning, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with a divorce attorney named Patricia Chen. I explained the situation and showed her screenshots of Jake's text messages. What your husband is doing is psychological abuse, Patricia said immediately. He's deliberately causing you emotional distress for the purpose of gaining control over you. This kind of manipulation can be relevant in divorce proceedings. I want to understand all my options before I make any decisions, I told her. Patricia explained Arizona's divorce laws, including how assets would be divided and what documentation I should gather if I decided to file. She also referred me to a therapist who specialized in emotional abuse and manipulation. Over the next week, I began quietly preparing for the possibility of divorce while continuing to play the role of the desperate wife trying to save her marriage. I opened a separate bank account at a different financial institution and began transferring small amounts of money from our joint accounts. I gathered important documents, birth certificate, passport, financial records, insurance policies, and stored copies in a safety deposit box Jake didn't know about. I also started documenting Jake's behavior. I saved screenshots of his text messages and began keeping a journal of his statements and actions during our fake separation. Most importantly, I made copies of everything on our shared computer, including financial records and communications, in case I needed them later. While I was secretly preparing for divorce, I continued playing the role Jake expected. I maintained my efforts to be the perfect wife, cooking elaborate meals, keeping the house spotless, and constantly asking what I could do to save our marriage. But now I was watching Jake's behavior with complete clarity instead of desperation. I could see how calculated his responses were, how he'd give me just enough hope to keep me trying without actually committing to working on our relationship. Jake was clearly following Brad's coaching about maintaining control and keeping me insecure. He'd make vague statements about progress in his thinking, but always followed them with reminders that he wasn't ready to make any decisions about our future. The most disgusting part was watching Jake enjoy his newfound sense of power. He'd smile slightly when I thanked him for small kindnesses, as if my gratitude was confirmation of his superiority. He started making more demands about meals, housework, and my schedule, testing how far he could push his temporary advantage. After 3 weeks of this charade, I realized I had enough documentation and preparation to implement my plan. I'd gathered financial records, secured my own assets, and consulted with both a divorce attorney and a therapist about the psychological manipulation I'd endured. I was ready for Jake to end his little game. The opportunity came on a Friday evening in April. Jake came home from work in an unusually good mood, and I suspected his friends had told him it was time to conclude Operation Reset. "Lisa," he said over dinner, "I've been doing a lot of thinking during our time apart." "About what?" I asked, playing my role perfectly. "About us, about our marriage, about what I want from a relationship." He paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the moment. "I think I'm ready to work things out," he said. "These past few weeks have shown me that you're willing to fight for our marriage, and that means something to me." "Really?" I said, injecting hope and relief into my voice. "You want to try again?" "I do," Jake said. "But I think this experience has been good for both of us. I think you understand now how important it is to prioritize our relationship and make sure I feel valued." "I do understand," I said. "I never want to go through anything like this again." Jake smiled with satisfaction. "I don't think you will. I think you've learned what it means to be a good wife." That's when Jake made his fatal mistake. "Actually," he said, clearly unable to resist bragging about his successful manipulation, "I should probably be honest with you about something." "What do you mean?" "The separation wasn't entirely real," Jake said, still smiling. "Brad and the guys convinced me to test how committed you really were to our marriage. They said most wives get complacent and need a wake-up call to remember what they have." I stared at him, letting him continue. "So we staged the whole thing to see how desperate you'd get and whether you'd step up to save our relationship. And you did. You proved that you're willing to fight for us." Jake looked incredibly pleased with himself. Brad was right, sometimes you have to shake things up to establish the right dynamic in a marriage. I nodded slowly. "So this was all a test?" "Exactly. And you passed. You showed me that you're willing to be the wife I need." I stood up from the dinner table and walked to our bedroom. Jake followed me, probably expecting gratitude or relief that our separation was over. Instead, I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out an envelope I'd prepared that morning. "You're absolutely right, Jake," I said, handing him the envelope. "I did learn something important during these past few weeks." "What's that?" he asked, still smiling. "I learned that my husband is capable of deliberately causing me psychological distress for 3 weeks because his single friends convinced him it would be fun to see how desperate I'd get." Jake's smile started to fade. "Lisa, it wasn't like that. I also learned that my husband enjoys watching me beg and grovel to save a marriage he was never actually planning to leave." "You're misunderstanding. Open the envelope, Jake." He opened it and found divorce papers that Patricia Chen had prepared the week before. "Congratulations," I said. "You passed your test. You've proven that you're not the husband I need." Jake stared at the papers in shock. "Lisa, this is crazy. It was just a harmless test to strengthen our marriage." "Nothing about the past 3 weeks was harmless," I interrupted. "You put me through hell because you thought it would be entertaining to watch me desperately try to save our marriage. You enjoyed having power over me. You let your single friends coach you on how to manipulate your own wife. But I was always planning to work things out. It was never real." "The psychological damage was real, Jake. The 3 weeks of emotional torture were real. Your enjoyment of my desperation was real." I showed him printouts of his text messages with Brad and the others. "How did you? I found your coaching notes in your pocket 2 weeks ago," I said. "So while you were playing your little game, I was documenting everything and preparing for this conversation." Jake sat down on our bed, still staring at the divorce papers. "Lisa, please. Can't we talk about this? I admit it was a stupid idea, but I never meant to hurt you. I thought it would actually help our marriage." "How exactly would psychologically torturing me help our marriage?" "Brad said it would make you more grateful and less likely to take me for granted. He said married women need reminders that their husbands have options." The fact that Jake was still citing Brad's advice even while trying to apologize showed how deeply he'd internalized this toxic mindset. "Jake, do you understand that what you did was emotional abuse?" "It wasn't abuse," he protested. "It was just a test to see how committed you were." You deliberately caused me psychological distress for your own amusement. You manipulated my emotions and enjoyed watching me suffer. That's the definition of emotional abuse. Over the next hour, Jake cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and desperation. He promised to cut contact with Brad and his friends. He offered to go to couples counseling. He begged for another chance to prove he could be a better husband. But I'd already made my decision. The man who could spend 3 weeks psychologically torturing his wife for sport wasn't someone I could ever trust again. Even if you were sorry, which I don't think you really are, the damage is done, I told him. I've seen who you really are when you think you have power over me. I've seen how much you enjoyed manipulating my emotions. I can never unsee that. The divorce proceedings took about 6 months to finalize. Jake contested the divorce initially, claiming it was an overreaction to a misunderstanding, but Patricia Chen presented the text messages and my documentation of his behavior as evidence of psychological abuse. Arizona's no-fault divorce laws meant Jake's manipulation didn't significantly impact the asset division, but it did influence the judge's decisions about some disputed items and the timeline for proceedings. The most satisfying part of the process was watching Jake face the social consequences of his actions. When our friends and family learned why I was filing for divorce, the reaction was swift and brutal. Jake's colleagues at work were particularly disgusted when they learned he'd been bragging about psychologically manipulating his wife. Several people reported the conversations to HR, and while Jake wasn't fired, he was passed over for a promotion he'd been expecting and was eventually transferred to a different department. Brad and the other friends who'd coached Jake also faced consequences. Word spread through their social circle about their advice to Jake, and several women they'd been dating ended those relationships once they learned about the manipulation strategies these men were sharing with each other. Jake moved out of our house and into an apartment across town. According to mutual friends, he struggled with the reality that his marriage had actually ended. He'd been so confident in his ability to control the situation that he'd never considered the possibility that his test would backfire. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I heard through a mutual friend that Jake had tried to reconcile with an ex-girlfriend from college, but she'd rejected him after learning about his marriage and divorce. Apparently he told her the whole story, thinking it would make him look like the victim, our friend reported. But she said any man who would psychologically torture his wife for fun wasn't someone she wanted to date. As for me, the divorce was the best decision I ever made. Once I was free from Jake's manipulation and criticism, I realized how much he'd damaged my self-esteem and confidence during our final year of marriage. I started therapy to process the emotional abuse and learn to recognize the warning signs of manipulative behavior. I also threw myself into my nursing career and was promoted to charge nurse within a year of my divorce. 18 months after my divorce, I started dating Mark, a pediatric doctor I met through work. Mark was the complete opposite of Jake, kind, considerate, and genuinely interested in building a partnership based on mutual respect. When I told Mark about my marriage and divorce, his reaction was immediate and clear. What kind of person thinks it's okay to psychologically torture someone they claim to love? You're better off without him. Mark and I have been together for 2 years now, and our relationship is everything my marriage to Jake wasn't: honest, supportive, and built on genuine care for each other's well-being. I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I'd confronted Jake immediately when I found his coaching notes instead of playing along with his game. Would he have apologized and changed his behavior? Could our marriage have survived? But I don't regret my approach. Jake's reaction to being caught showed his true character. Even when confronted with evidence of his deliberate cruelty, he couldn't acknowledge the serious harm he'd caused. He continued to minimize his behavior and blame his friends for giving him bad advice. The man who could spend 3 weeks enjoying his wife's desperation because his single friends thought it would be funny wasn't someone who was ever going to be a reliable, trustworthy partner. Sometimes people ask if I think Jake learned anything from the experience. Based on what I've heard through mutual friends, the answer seems to be no. He still maintains that the divorce was an overreaction and that his test was misunderstood. Jake never took responsibility for the psychological damage he caused or acknowledged that his behavior constituted abuse. Instead, he painted himself as the victim of a wife who couldn't take a joke and divorce attorney who encouraged me to overreact. But that's fine with me. Jake's inability to learn from his mistakes isn't my problem anymore. I'm building a happy, healthy life with someone who would never dream of testing my commitment through psychological manipulation. The best revenge wasn't getting back at Jake, it was building a life so much better than what I had with him that I'm grateful every day for his cruel little game. His manipulation freed me to find someone who actually deserves my love and commitment. And Brad? Last I heard, he was still single and still giving relationship advice to married men who are stupid enough to listen to him. Some people never learn, but that's not my problem either. I'm too busy being happy with someone who treats me with respect to worry about the men who think marriage is a game to be won through psychological manipulation. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering exactly who someone really is before it's too late to escape. Jake's fake breakup saved me from wasting any more years with someone who viewed our marriage as a power struggle instead of a partnership. For that, I'll always be grateful.
Okay, time to read the comments and see what people have to say about this one. Comment number 1. Lisa's decision to play along and document every cruel move was next-level genius. She didn't just expose Jake's manipulation, she built an airtight case against him. Can't wait to see how she uses this in court. Now let's go to comment number 2. Watching this toxic scheme crumble under Lisa's calm strategy gave me chills. She showed incredible resilience, turning Jake's abuse tactics into his own undoing. I'm genuinely impressed by how this narrative spotlights the psychology of manipulation. Lisa's methodical documentation isn't just a plot device, it's a masterclass in reclaiming agency. Too often, stories about abuse focus only on the trauma. Here we see a smart, strategic response that empowers the victim and holds the abuser accountable. This arc elevates the tale from mere drama to an instructive example of emotional resilience and the power of evidence. Frankly, I wish more stories tackled these dynamics with such clarity and depth. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe.